Now we're on to number E, another presentation. Derek Smithy is going to come forward and talk to us about the ELC.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and members of the council. It's an exciting evening to get to come to you and talk about progress and completion over the last 12 months of work on Edmond's newest park, the preserve at Hafer Park. What I'm going to do for the next few minutes is go over mostly a little bit on process, mostly on product, because I think we've gone over history in the previous two meetings, so I don't think I need to belabor that point very much. So I do have a bunch of people here that if I say anything wrong, I am certain they will correct my misspeaking. So we are at Edmond's newest park, the preserve at Hafer Park. For those of you unaware, it's the 22 acres in the yellow dashed line just south of Hafer Park, south of Spring Creek. Most people know where Panera Bread is, and it's essentially behind Panera Bread and that Bank First location. The voters brought that into the city of Edmond to bring it into the city of Edmond ownership. You guys charged us to the Edmond Land Conservancy of investigating the potential of putting that into conservation easement about a year ago. And we, through ELC and the ELC work group, a special work group formed to facilitate the process, have meetings with neighbors, have worked over the last year to come up with this proposal. The 8 people on the left, the 9 people on the left are the Edmond Land Conservancy, and then the individual membership on the working group is on the right. And as you can see, they represent not only ELC, but Ryan with the city, several citizen committee members, Jacqueline and Lydia, Chad King, an ecological expert from the University of Central Oklahoma, and Taylor Hildenbrand, who was representing the City of Edmond Parks and Recreation Department. Real brief history timeline. You guys know all of these things. The 22 acres passed. We formed a work group. We've drafted language. We visited with a lot of people. We did an ecological assessment late last year. We talked about the conservation easement and how that would look and language within it. We've had a community listening session that was intentionally set up to have the public listen to us and us listen to them. And then we had a draft conservation easement that's coming before you today, along with a companion memorandum of understanding, which I'll explain a little bit more about that here in just a second. There's a picture of the listening session. We were honored to have Josh in attendance. It was pretty well attended for a not too accommodating evening. It was frigid that night, so we were happy to get that many people, and we were excited, frankly, when we left that meeting because we had nothing given to us but attaboys. There was no "you satanic creatures." That was a great piece of work, and we're excited to support what you guys have done. I want to briefly also touch on a couple of foundational underpinnings on the project that we felt were critical as we move forward. Of course, nature first and people second was kind of a mantra that we enjoyed utilizing far too often in our meetings. We wanted to be sure we utilized existing infrastructure. Infrastructure costs can be pretty high, so water, roads, parking, those kinds of things are expensive. And if we could use Hafer Park for that infrastructure, we wanted to do that. And of course, we wanted to stay within the $1.5-ish million that we had available to spend, because the city spent around $4 million to acquire the property. That gave us an operating budget of about $1.5, $1.6 million. We wanted to make sure we had an ecological assessment in place, because you can't protect what you don't know, what you don't have. So we wanted to know what we had to work with. So the UCO staff and professors got to work, did a brilliant piece of work on an ecological assessment, and brought that to us, looked at soils, trees, other vegetation, reptiles, amphibians, birds, mammals. It's a pretty exhaustive report, and they did a fantastic job. We wanted to earmark funds for restoration. So even though this was going to be a nature park, a minimally disturbed natural area, we wanted to make sure that the restoration that needed to happen to make it a natural area again occurred. Because this was a farm at one time. There was a home place there. So there are non-native species, even native species, that can become somewhat invasive that we wanted to make sure we had opportunity to control those. Educational piece, because when this is put in place, we believe it's going to be a key educational component for Edmond schools and UCO. We wanted to make sure the composition of the work group was good. We wanted to do our due diligence. I'll talk about that more here in just a second. We wanted to make sure there was a whole bunch of easement issues that Barrett ferreted out. There were some curiosities in those multiple easements on that 22 acres, but we fought through those. And in the end, we created a memorandum of understanding, which is essentially how we're going to execute the conservation easement and language in the easement. So here's the due diligence part. You know, we've updated you all quarterly. We had the public listening session I just mentioned earlier. We met with the Parks and Rec people a couple of times. We met with Urban Forestry, and I do want to give a shout out to like Kurt Atkinson, who did a nice piece of work on the 22 acres with a tree focus, a forestry focus. So we had that to look at as well. We met with the adjoining landowners, neighborhood groups, and then we did some podcast articles and other public forums. Now, here's some key points as we go forward, especially regarding the easement. Now, the easement, as you might understand, a conservation easement is a legally binding document which restricts what can happen on the 22 acres in perpetuity. Well, when the vote happened, it was on the 22 acres that you might recall from that map. But as you'll see here in a minute, that property does not actually abut Spring Creek to the north. And that would actually be about 25 to 28 acres. And I want to talk to you a little bit more about that here in just a second. I want to point out differences in the tracks. There are some do's and don'ts, most of which are obvious in Edmond parks, but there are some additional restrictions that we are proposing to you all in this conservation easement. We want to make sure the purpose and the permanence is carefully enunciated in both the easement and the MOU. And then the memorandum of understanding, how, when, and where's of the easement do's and don'ts. How does Edmond actually go about making this happen in partnership with the Edmond Land Conservancy? Because if you all adopt this, it would be a partnership between the city and your Edmond Land Conservancy. And then, of course, the emphasis would be on collaboration and flexibility. Now, there's an access strip, which I'll talk about here in just a minute, and we wanted to make sure that that access strip, we are approaching that a little differently, because that access strip could be access to 15th Street that right now does not exist. The actual land under easement would be 22 acres, but we're proposing 25 or 28, and you'll see that here in just a second. The partnership, as I mentioned, between ELC and the City of Edmond, we're kind of proposing as a straw man the model of using the Parks and Rec Board as the conduit to execute the will of both the City Council and in partnership with the ELC to make sure that the conservation easement is honored. Talk about maybe the conservation of the parks more. You know, a conservation component we noticed is maybe missing in the Parks and Rec Board. We thought maybe a conservation vision lens might be important there, perhaps even an ELC member. And then the restrictions that we have that are above and beyond ordinary on a park. Here is the tracts as they currently exist. And I want to point out a couple of things. One is the tract up above. One is the 22-acre tract that we're all familiar with. And you can see the access tract just to the south that goes to 15th Street. In the conservation easement and in the MOU, that tract is what is being dealt with in a unique way. And the conservation easement proposes and contemplates a potential public-private partnership with landowners, adjoining landowners, to make parking and vehicular access and parking and then foot traffic into the preserve proper. The official proposal as is coming to you today includes a bridge from Hafer Park into the property, and I'll show you a little bit more about that in a second. But I wanted to point out the access tract. We are proposing that be handled differently and uniquely to facilitate a public and private partnership. And we're also proposing that you have before you the tracts 4 and tract 3 be woven into the conservation easement. and be dealt with as one unit, everything south of Spring Creek. That's completely your decision. They're both Edmond properties. All of these are Edmond properties today. It would just be how they are managed and whether they are put into conservation easement or not. I wanted to point out some easement highlights. The conservation easement is essentially the rules of engagement. The rules, the purpose, perpetually, contractually designate the land as minimally developed natural area. That's what the purpose is. That's what we want to make sure we protect. There are a couple of unique prohibited uses that I want to highlight. We maintained, and I would say there was a lot of discussion around dogs, but we did want to maintain dogs were okay, provided they're leased, no drones. I want to highlight no bicycles. We're proposing no bicycles on the 22 acres, no hunting or taking of wildlife, no picnicking. If you want to go on a picnic, fantastic. We support that. Go to Hafer Park. The natural area is not a picnicking area. No cell phone towers and no construction or permanent structures. And then the MOU, we propose a name. We got tired of calling it the 22 acres, so we're proposing the preserve at Hafer Park. Development be done jointly between ELC and you all with the City of Edmond. We wanted to make sure we were within budget. You'll see a little budget page here in just a second. So there would be $1.6 million in funds that have already been earmarked and available to the preserve. The access tract that I just mentioned previously that was going to be handled differently, and it includes a schedule of permitted improvements. And these are the things that we believe can be done and should be done in the next couple of years to meet the goals of a minimally developed nature park. One is access, and of course we propose a bridge from west of the duck pond, if you're familiar with Hafer Park, between the playground and the duck pond, a bridge that goes from Hafer into the preserve. And I'll show you a slide here in just a second of this kind of taken in total. That bridge is a major chunk of change, and it eats up the majority of the budget. But if we want to utilize the existing infrastructure of Hafer Park, you have to build a bridge between Hafer and to the preserve. Trails, a total of about 1 mile of trails, foot trails, 1/2 mile of improved surface, where all citizens of Edmond can utilize the park and access the property, and then another 1/2 mile of minimally improved trails that would be dirt or mulch. And ongoing restoration and preservation activities, the removal of non-native vegetation, and the fostering or reintroduction of native vegetation to maintain its natural and original character. Trash cans, benches, boundary fencing, additional educational signage, and then lastly, an outdoor amphitheater and classroom. Don't think anything fancy. Think Boy Scout wooden benches, wooden platform, very rustic, is also proposed and within the budget. Here's what we ended up with, kind of conceptually. There's the bridge, the duck pond, the playground, bridge. Here's the improved trail and the unimproved trail. So we are proposing those, the bridge. The amphitheater was originally conceived down here where the old house used to be. It could be, though, up here. Once equipment gets in there and professional staff gets in, they can pick the most appropriate area for that. Signage, of course, you need to have wayfinding signs, and then the access track down here that we talked about earlier. So that would be the plan. Restoration activities would have to happen immediately because the sooner the better, and it'll take several years, frankly, for that to happen. That's not a short, easy fix. There's the budget. We have this at $1.57 million. We think there's about 1.6, but that should cover it. And that covers the trail, the bridge, revegetation activities for a couple of years, 10 years of maintenance for Edmond maintenance staff to make sure the park is properly maintained. Everything we believe is necessary through the consultants to get the project done. So with that, I'd like to say a big thank you. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to serve you. We at the Edmond Land Conservancy are your servants, and especially the volunteer groups from the work group that we spend a lot of time and energy, and they work, I can't say for free because I had to buy a little food and beer to keep them engaged, but it was a great process and I was excited to be a part of leading it. So with that, I will take any questions or comments.
Council, any questions, comments?
I have an initial question. I know you talked with the surrounding property owners, and I think that was primarily the commercial business owners to the south. And did they bring up any concerns? I think this is going to be a popular area. As minimal as it's going to be, it will be Edmond's first nature park, other than what we have at Arcadia Lake. Any concern from them, the amount of people coming closer to their property, the property line? I noticed some talk about fencing. Is that where you're thinking it would be? Or if you can go into that.
No specified concerns about access to the property, the preserve, or their businesses like Panera Park. They're at the shopping center. The Victoria Wood people didn't express any concerns to me about that either. The SWIG and that development, I really didn't get to visit with them, so I can't really speak to that property. Now, on the fencing, there are some areas, especially, I don't know if I'm skilled enough to go back, especially here. These are the townhomes, and this is undeveloped, and there probably is a need to have a little bit of a visual barrier between what is Edmond property and private property. And so the fencing we're proposing is essentially the split rail cedar fencing that's rustic but aesthetic. And so there would probably be some of that here. There's a huge retaining wall throughout some of this, retaining walls here. Now, one thing we did talk about is the potential maybe for split rail fencing somewhere around along the creek to limit the potential for kids getting in trouble. But they're supposed to be on the trails anyway, one. We know that 4-year-olds don't read very well. So that might be an issue. I know the fencing at Hafer is spotty. So that might be something we'd want to look at as well. But primarily we looked at fencing here.
Very good. Any other questions? There's a lot to digest here because there's going to be future and more conversations on how to move forward.
Can we talk about next steps?
That's where I was getting ready to
Sorry.
go. There are some. I know staff was staff going to talk about the next steps for the community engagement. Oh, didn't see you over there. I was looking for you.
Ryan Oxner, Director of Community Quality. Staff has been involved in this process as a support role. You all engaged ELC to see this effort through, and so we've been just supportive in that and wanted them to bring forth their best proposal and best product. So our next step is staff then transitions to a review and look closely at all the documentation that's been provided, and also listen to input and direction from you, council. So that's what we'll be looking for over the coming period of time, and we're here to vet that from a city staff perspective so that we can then make recommendations to you all.
Ryan, can you talk about, I think there was a presentation of the Parks Board.
Yes, thank you for the reminder. So this was presented to Park Board last week when they met at their regular meeting, and because we were wanting to prepare for the opportunity for this to come back to council at the next meeting or the meeting after that, and Parks and Recreation Advisory Board may not meet before that happens. So we wanted to give them a review of it in its current draft form, and they voted to recommend approval of it in principle with a couple of caveats. And those two caveats are the first one, that they voted to approve it with the caveat of amending item 14 to indicate that should ELC cease operations, the easement essentially automatically revert to the city. So that's the first one. And the second one is that they recommended to not include additional city-owned property in the vicinity. And those were the two caveats. But with that, they did recommend approval in principle and in its current draft form, understanding that it hadn't been completely vetted from a city staff perspective.
Ryan, are you prepared as a staff member to have an opinion on that tonight, the additional land?
The additional land?
Yeah.
I have not been able to identify a reason to recommend that be included. So I would recommend this evening, based on what I understand, to recommend to you all that would not be included. Certainly, we agree with the sentiment from a Parks and Recreation perspective that we see a need to program it and operate it very similar to that is actually under the easement. Certainly, the Parks and Recreation Advisory Board provides oversight, as they have for a long time, and they will absolutely be concerned with what happens to the property next to the park, regardless.
Very good.
Can I bring up one more item?
Well, I was going to let me ask one question. During your evaluation, will there be other opportunities for community engagement with that, or are you just looking for the council to have engagement with you all?
We'll be looking for council to have engagement.
Okay.
I feel the sentiment is that ELC and the way they worked through the process provided public engagement.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yes, sir.
So this kind of scope with ELC in this process really had to do with the conservation easement itself and the land specifically, and a plan for that. If I remember correctly, or if I understand it correctly, it really, even though they took the financial piece of that and created a budget that Derek just went over, I kind of feel like we also need to decide on the conservation easement, but also decide whether or not we do want to dedicate that 1.6 million or the overage from the tax collection dedicated to this property. So just, I don't know if that's already understood or assumed, or if that's something we need to cover as well.
I mean, I think it's not something that has been decided for sure, and I think even if it's, quote, dedicated, what does that look like, right? So does it go towards infrastructure and projects, and then I guess there was some for maintenance over the 10-year period, or is there a greater portion that needs to be reserved for kind of an endowment type structure for the maintenance of the preserve? So, I mean, I think there's definitely some discussion to be had about that overage amount and the best, most prudent, appropriate way to use it. And again, I mean, I appreciate all the work that this committee has done and all the people who've contributed to it, the city engagement. But I too feel like now, how do I say this? I mean, I just want it understood that we don't necessarily just accept 100% of what is presented to us, but it's something we take under advisement, considering staff input and everything else. And we're not voting tonight. We're really in this more receiving mode, soaking this in. And I'm excited about it.
Yeah. Also, the opportunity to bring up.
Maybe just tackled Ryan.
I would say Ryan was more than just an innocent bystander in this process. He was critical to getting it done. So I thank you, Ryan, for all you did. We have always operated under the assumption this is Edmond's land. This is your property, and you all are the caretakers of Edmond's real assets, and this is one. So we did our level best to bring you what we thought best accomplished that objective, which included a budget to eat up the whole amount that was in excess. We didn't want to go over. We thought that was ridiculous. But we did want to bring you a budget that ate up that whole $1.57 million. My fear always is what something costs in March will not be what it costs in August.
Absolutely.
So that's always a fear. I mean, that's just the way it is.
It's
So there
reality.
is a contingency built into that, but that's always a fear. And, you know, I can tell you that ELC, we stand ready to help in any way we can to make that a reality, or whatever the city of Edmond needs in terms of conservation protection and enhancement of natural properties. We stand ready to serve, because we take that mission to heart, and we really believe it.
Absolutely.
Mr. Murdoch, how is the easement itself, the easement document? Have you had a chance to look at it?
Yes,
Do you have an opinion?
it's an easement document. It covers many of the areas in which the council was interested in, and there may be certain details that we need to review as a council as a whole, and we will do that at a public meeting with public input. But they did a great job.
I appreciate all your work. That's a lot of work. It looks really
Absolutely.
great. A lot of great input, I love how you put your budget out, and you budgeted everything you wanted in there.
We did our level best.
Greatly appreciate it.
Okay,
Future-
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.